Good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar brought to you by SolarPower Europe and Axis Capital about the increasing effect of extreme weather events on solar PV projects. So, ahead of everything, a special thanks to Axis Capital for supporting this webinar on a very important topic that has taken a backseat to some extent in the recent months, which is climate change, of course, and in particular, the impact of climate change on solar projects. Today, we'll be talking about hurricanes, wildfires, hailstorms and flooding, and the implications of extreme weather events on solar PV projects, and also about what can be done to mitigate these effects. My name is Máté Heisz. I'm Head of International Cooperation at SolarPower Europe, and it is my pleasure to be the host of today's webinar. But before introducing our speaker today, let me just point out that there will be a Q&A session after the presentation, and so we would already like to encourage the participants to ask questions, and you can ask questions in written form using the application on your right-hand side. So please do already post questions. We will collect them during the presentation and we'll read them out in the Q&A session. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dan Stevens, who's risk engineer at Axis Capital. He is an expert with almost 20 years of experience in the renewable energy industry, and so he will be speaking about the implications of extreme weather events on solar PV projects today. And we are very much looking forward to hearing from you, Dan, on how we can mitigate these effects. So Dan, over to you.
Great, thanks Máté, and welcome everyone to this webinar. As Máté mentioned, I've been in renewables nearly 20 years. I trained as an environmental scientist, so really my reason for getting into renewable energy was to start offering some solutions to the problems of climate change. So I'm very glad to be taking this presentation today, and thanks to Eco Money of Axis for helping bring all these slides together. Okay. So, as Máté mentioned, what I'd like to do today is to cover a few topics which are of very big importance to us as insurers, and giving a balance of that bottom line impact and the technical things we see going wrong out there when these things hit, and some ideas to how they can be mitigated. So I'll kick off with some discussion around climate change at a quite high level, and how that is driving the increase in both the severity and the frequency of these events. Then talk about primary perils. Perils is a term used by the insurance community to describe events which result in claims. In this context, we're talking about natural catastrophe perils, or NatCat. Primary perils I'll talk about first will be tropical storms, and then talk about secondary perils, which as the name suggests, are ones which have a smaller impact but are no less worrying in terms of lives lost and property damage, and becoming more and more of an issue for us. So of those secondary perils, we'll cover flood, hail, and then wildfire, and then just wrap up with some conclusions. Okay, so just kicking off then, a bit about us. Axis Capital is an insurer. We have a global presence across 7 locations listed out there. We've been going since 2001. I work within the renewable underwriting team within Axis. There are 20 of us spread across various offices, San Francisco, New York. I work in the London office, and we have 20 dedicated underwriters with a collective experience of pushing on 70 years on writing renewable assets, and full-time claims adjusters just working on renewables projects. At a wider level, we serve 200 current countries and territories, and we like to think ourselves as leaders in the renewables sphere. Events like this are a great opportunity for us to expand a bit more about Axis and to do what I think we do best, which is to work with the projects to help mitigate some of these risks before we get down the track and a claim hits. Just some quick information about the company bottom lines. We're at about 7 billion in gross premiums, and total capital within that is about 7.4 billion. We are an actual carrier, so we pay our own claims. When a claim comes in from a project that's been hit by one of these events, it comes from our coffers. So as a result, we also invest. We have a big investment portfolio, and a lot of people dedicated to managing that investment suite across the world. In terms of our rating, you can see on the right-hand side there, we're well respected in the financial markets with our robustness and our ability to keep underwriting these assets. Okay, so what do we do? Well, as I mentioned, we are a true insurance company in as much as we carry these risks. No construction project is risk-free, and this quote from Michael Latin says that you can manage the risk, minimize it, accept it, or transfer it, but you can't ignore it. And that really underlines everything we do. So how do we help manage risk? Well, we allow our clients to transfer risk onto us in simple terms. We write premiums and we offer cover. We safeguard the clients and the property against risk of theft or loss from physical damage. And importantly, we do that to make sure they stay in business when they have these unexpected issues come through. Those three icons at the bottom just cover the three key things that we cover from a renewables point of view. We cover all causes of physical damage. We also offer replacement costs for components so they're broken. We do business interruption cover if there's a physical damage that occurs. And we also do some third-party liability and environmental loss cover as well. But those three elements are transportation, so bringing turbines, solar panels, battery stuff to the site. We cover the construction of those assets, and then we also write through the operations phase. And you'll see those three icons crop up a few times in this presentation. Okay, so moving on to the topic then. I want to start with climate change because I think anybody who hasn't been living under a rock for the past 10, 15 years will know that this is becoming a bigger and bigger issue, and there's broader and broader scientific consensus that anthropogenic CO2 emissions are causing climate change, and that's being manifested in a number of ways, chiefly on our climate and weather events. So just started with some overview information here. From an insurance perspective, this graph here comes from Munich Re, and this just lists out three types of weather-related nat cat perils. This information is from 1980 to 2018. On the y-axis, you've got the number of events, and these events are essentially categorized as big events depending on the GDP of the country. So the trigger level varies a bit, but the y-axis is the number of events per year, x-axis is the year, and you've got three types. Meteorological events, which includes tropical storms, hydrological events, which is floods or earth movements, rock slides, earth slides caused by mass movements, earthquakes as well, and then the yellow bars are the climatological events, by which we mean extreme temperatures, drought, forest fires. And as you can see, as you move from left to right, they're on the increase, particularly the hydrological events. So you can see in 1980, there were about, I think, 60 events in 1980 that were catastrophes caused by these hydro events. By 2018, that's nearly 400, so it's nearly a tenfold increase. Those flood events are on the rise. However, for us, the windstorm is consistently the #1 peril that we insure. So damage from windstorms is having the biggest impact, and we see that time and time again. As an industry, this is our kind of #1 bet noir, our big focus. Hail events are on the up as well, and deadly wildfires we saw last year in the US and Australia becoming more regular. So I guess I just wanted to show this slide to show you that, just in broad terms, these things are on the increase. The mechanism driving these is not always, of course, just to do with climate change, but as I'll go into more detail later on each of the sections, when you trace it back, more and more you are seeing conditions getting more and more optimal for big loss events, whether that's sea surface temperatures getting hotter because of climate change, which drives the engine of these tropical storms, whether it's sea level rise driving more storm surges, which is the biggest killer from floods. It's not rainfall related. Rain is actually storm surges, which does the worst damage, or whether it's just temperatures getting hotter and areas getting drier that are already quite dry, like East Coast of Australia, California, making it perfect conditions for wildfires to get sparked. Sorry. Okay, so on to the first lot then, primary perils. I want to talk about tropical storms here. Tropical storms, the term given for three types, typhoons, hurricanes, and cyclones. But before I come on to that, just a bit of an overview. So we talked about the kind of 40-year period. Now this is focusing in on 2019. And we're just listing out here the floods and the tropical storms and the wildfires. So it's the same information, but just focusing on 2019. So both tropical storms and earthquakes are NatCats and natural catastrophes, which are big enough over the years to be seen as a primary issue for the insurance community. So we call them primary perils. They're usually really well monitored as a result. A lot of time, effort, money, computing power goes into trying to predict when they're going to occur, how bad they're going to be, and what the impact's going to be. We talk about, I think, what a probable maximum loss, which a lot of work is done by very smart people like actuaries to run global circulation models, an awful lot of statistics, and to come up with predictions before we write a project as to how likely it is that project's going to get hit by a category 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hurricane. Because these things are such big issues for us, we spend a lot of people power trying to get the predictions as good as possible. In 2019, there were 10 of these NatCat events across the world, and 6 of those were storms. So they're the ones in green here, dotted around the globe, everywhere from, pretty high up actually in the States there with tornadoes kicking in, all the way through to typhoons in Asia. So just to make it clear, this is a big part of the overall NatCat loss is the windstorms. Okay, nomenclature then. As I said, the word tropical storms is a bit of a tricky one because tropical storm both equates to the wind speed of that event. When a storm event gathers enough pace and enough speed, it qualifies as being a tropical storm. And then as it gets stronger, it moves into different categorizations. However, tropical storms are actually the word given to 3 different types. So we call them 3 different things depending on where they come from. So hurricanes, typhoons, and cyclones are all technically tropical storms. Hurricanes are in the North Atlantic, North Pacific, and they happen from kind of now through to November. People working in the US will know this year is already a bit of a record year. I think for the first time ever, we've got 3 events that have kicked in before June. June the 1st is the kind of nominal start date for the hurricane season in the States. We've had 2 named storms already and 3 actual storm systems starting up. So as I'll say in a few moments' time, 2020 is already looking like a record year for hurricanes in the States, as if we didn't have enough problems already with COVID. Typhoons are in the Northwest Pacific. Again, occur similar time, May through to November. Cyclones, they occur on both sides of the equator, but they're in the South Pacific and Indian Ocean. And Northern Hemisphere ones occur at the same time. Southern Hemisphere ones are in the Southern Hemisphere summer, autumn period, so November to April. It's pretty obvious, but I just want to set that out. The little colored dots beneath that are the individual storms. I think this is like a 10-year period we plotted here. Won't go into too much detail here, but essentially, as the storm gathers pace, it moves into higher and higher categories, and they get given different colors on these maps. So in essence, an awful lot of storm activity. As I said earlier, these tropical storms, wherever they occur, they're all driven by the same engine, which is the latent heat of the oceans. Without that heat, they don't start. You get convection from the ocean surface, moisture going up, and then that getting charged by more and more heat as it progresses and moves higher and higher through the wind speed categories. Okay, this slide here is just focusing on a few of the most deadly storms that hit the US recently. So the 5 most costly events to have made landfall in the States all occurred in the last 30 years. And of those 5, 4 of them were in the last 15. What I thought was interesting about these data here on this slide is that you've got the name of the storm on the left and then where it made landfall in the Americas. And then the third column is the wind speed. So the wind speeds for hurricanes are categorized from Cat 1 to the weakest to Cat 5. But interestingly, the damage that was caused by these events doesn't necessarily correlate to the wind speed. So if you just pick out Hurricane Maria, which is the top of the list because it caused the most damage, that's $91.6 billion damage that struck Puerto Rico in 2017, back in 2017. But it was only a Cat 4 storm. I say only. I think the wind speeds measured there were kind of coming up to 150 odd miles an hour, and then all the Met towers and measurement buoys got ripped apart by the storm, so they stopped recording the wind speed. So that's just how brutal it was. But as you go down, you see more of these hurricanes coming through. Hurricane Andrew hitting Florida, that was a Cat 5, but the damage was less. And I think that's critical as well, is that as populations grow, areas get more developed, you get these twin issues of more people and bigger cities, bigger areas to get hit by these storms, and then potentially the other issue of climate change driving more of these storms to come through. So excuse the pun, it's kind of a perfect storm, but these are big numbers. 2020, as I mentioned, isn't looking too good. University of Colorado has done a forecast here for 2020, and in fact, a number of other universities, U of A in Phoenix, Tucson, NOAA, a number of US laboratories have all said similar things. 2020 is going to be a record year. So Uni of Colorado is predicting 16 storms. Normally, there's 12 named storms in an average year. Of those 16, they reckon half of those are going to reach Category 1, which when it becomes a hurricane. And then of those, again, half as many again are going to become major, so Cat 3 or above. And underlining all of that, this is just, I think, bringing it full circle, which is that according to NOAA, it's a US Science Department, the water in the Gulf of Mexico is about 5 degrees Fahrenheit above normal. I think that's going to rise to maybe 8 degrees in some places this year. Again, latent heat in the ocean being the engine that powers these storms. That is a kind of, to me, the final tick in the box. This is totally coupled. So we've got a hot year in terms of surface temperatures of the water, and therefore we're going to have a probably very bad year in terms of storms. Okay, moving on to technical elements then. I've got a few case studies in this presentation of sites that we've been to visit. So these are risks that we've underwritten. At Axis, we're very keen to really understand what we're insuring and to work with the project sponsor to understand what's on the ground, understand the diligence done before they built the project. But then ultimately, if something comes through and a claim comes through, then we pay that claim. We're very proud that we pay our claims, we pay them on time. But one of my key roles in coming to Axis was to then do a lot of diligence on the post-claim events and go out to sites before events happen to understand how well they're being kept. And by this mechanism, we hope to both keep our eyes open more around how we're writing our risks and where we're spreading our bets, and also helping project sponsors to improve if there's areas we think they can improve on. This is a site in the tropics. Big storm came through, pretty typical failures. So PV panels acted a bit like wings. They took off, as this photo shows here. A lot of this was down to the panels not having fantastic fastening in place, lots of micro cracking, and this site also had a lot of debris being thrown at the panels. So that's kind of a typical failure mode where you've got either the panels flying off or the support systems buckling, but also you can have debris being thrown at the panels, which is super frustrating. It really can be avoided a lot of the time. If that debris is coming from neighboring land, bits of roofs, bits of car, whatever, then fair enough. But a lot of the time, it's coming from the site itself if it's not being kept clean. Other typical impacts from storms is the support structures getting a real kicking. If you haven't designed the support structures properly to hit the right design limit, then they'll fail. Simple as that. If the wind load is higher than the design load, it's a good chance it's going to buckle and fail. For tracking systems, we see failure both of the physical supports, the foundation, and the actuation system themselves. I'll come on to this in a bit more detail later, but I think it's a bit of a misnomer that if you've got a tracking system which will go into stow mode, you'll be fine and you'll ride through the storm. That's fine until you have a loss of power. If there's no power to put it into stow mode, then all bets are off and it's completely exposed. And then finally, with these storms comes a lot of rain. If you get soil liquefaction, then the foundations can start moving downhill. So this case study, the event was in September 2014, Hurricane Adil. The site was in Mexico, so in Baja California. About Category 3 when it hit land. The eye of the storm was about 25 miles away from the site, but still caused a lot of damage. And again, I think it's a bit of a misconception that the storm is going to go right through your project for it to get hit. In the actual eye of the hurricane, as I'm sure you all know, the winds are much lower. It's the wall that does the damage. the speed and the direction of the wind. Single axis tracker project. So the good news, none of the foundations failed, and the actual fixed parts, the actuators, were fine. However, the bracketing and the interlinkages of the actuation were really heavily damaged, lots of micro cracking and flooding, partly because of the rain, and partly because it's a coastal site in a bay, and it had a big storm surge overwhelming the coastal defenses. So that's kind of damage we're talking about. This is some photos. Just listing through it. This is the report, I think, from our risk adjuster, our loss adjuster, sorry. Some photos there of the actuation systems. Pretty much 100% of them failed testing. Connection bolts sheared off. I think they were slightly under-designed. So that all needed replacing. On the PV modules, they ran EL tests. The left-hand side photo is one that passed. Right-hand side is one that failed. I'm sure you guys all know about EL, how time-consuming, expensive it is. Only about 85% of those modules failed the test, but they ended up replacing all of them, which we see that as quite a common thing. It's often just cheaper just to start again than to run the risk of entering part of the site than having more things fail down the track. Finally, support structures. They had a double design here. Some of the arrays use single supports, which are on the left-hand side, and some of them use double supports, this kind of A-frame design. The former suffered way worse than the latter. So about 40% of the single leg racks failed, and about 10% of the double ones failed. Better load dispersal, stronger design. I'm not entirely sure why there was a mix of designs here, but I think if I was building again, I know which one I'd go for. Okay, so what could have been done on the mitigations? Well, from the design stage, we think it's really critical that people look very carefully at historical wind data in order to predict what might happen in future. Like wind turbines, solar systems have very well established codes of practice and design systems. Each country has different approaches to employing that, but fundamentally, you need to estimate what wind speed you're going to build to. The higher the wind speed you're going to try and survive, based on more money you've got to spend, you've got to have beefed up systems, bigger bolts, stronger designs, and it's a cost-benefit analysis. But if you're not putting good data in, then you're setting yourself up to fail. As well as getting your wind speed prediction right, you also need to understand how the ground's going to react when it's got, 10, 20 inches of rain hitting it in a matter of hours. So they're the two inputs to the design. You need to get those right. And then beyond that, it's really component decisions as far as I'm concerned. So, are you using the right module fasteners, locking nuts? I think it's well established that self-tapping screws are a bad idea. As I said earlier, on that site, double pile mounting would have definitely worked better than the single piles. And as I say, look at the planes themselves, look at the PVs themselves. Can you limit the tilt angle? The more you limit the angle of the panels, the less they're going to act like an airplane wing and take off when the wind gets underneath it. And don't assume that stone mode is a fail-safe. From a construction point of view, it's pretty straightforward. Use an experienced EPC contractor with a good track record that you're comfortable with. And particularly at the moment, a lot of these contractors are under a lot of pressure from COVID, picking up big delays because they've been stuck in their houses for a long time. So I think there is a risk there of people rushing a bit, which makes it even more important that you're doing inspections and you're testing and you're commissioning in a measured manner and not rushing. And finally, for the operation stage, obvious stuff, make sure all the bolts are torqued up regularly before the storm hits. You know it's going to happen. You'll get an alert. You'll see the storm tracking up from the ocean. So do the site lockdown properly, secure it all, clear the site, make sure you've got nothing on site that's going to get picked up and flung into your multi-million-dollar solar panels. ERPs, I'll talk about this a bit more later on. Emergency response plans are really critical, and the staff, the O&M staff, need to be really well trained in how to execute it. And it needs to be a kind of a living, breathing thing. If you have an emergency response plan, which you don't then revisit when you have a near miss and add in the lessons learned, then it's going to not be fit for purpose. So yeah, really, really critical is to get that response right. Okay, so now moving on to secondary perils. Despite the name secondary, they shouldn't be seen as a lower order effect. These can still do an awful lot of damage. And in fact, in 2018, the secondary perils that we saw in claims actually overtook the primary perils. So very much on our radar. So what are they? Well, they're high frequency medium severity loss events, but by medium, I'm still talking multi-millions of dollars a year. Hailstorms, landslides, drought and wildfires, and actually tornadoes. Tornadoes come under secondary perils. Despite being windstorms, they're not driven the same way as hurricanes and cyclones and typhoons. They're not as geographically limited. They can happen pretty much everywhere to lesser extents. You know, you're not going to get golf ball sized hailstones in London, hopefully, but you know, flooding and landslides can really affect everyone. Also, there can be a secondary effect. So if you've got as I said in the earlier example, you've got a tropical storm come through, kind of the primary impact might be the wind speeds tearing stuff up, but the secondary effect is the flooding that comes with it. So to me, they need just as much attention as a primary peril when you're designing the site and running it. And as I mentioned, in 2018, it overtook the primary ones on our radar. Okay, another pretty picture here. This is just focusing on 2019. So these are all the $1 billion and above weather and climate disasters that hit in the US. So if you just ignore the two gray and red icons, which are the hurricanes, all the rest there are secondary. So to put it in context, since 1980, the US has had about 265 disasters, which were above this $1 billion threshold. And over that 40-odd year period, there's nearly $2 trillion in cost of repair and cleanup. 2019 had 14 separate $1 billion events. So the 10 you talked about a few slides back was the primaries. This is all the events, and you can see them here on this map. They're localized. So you've got the Californian fires from last summer and autumn on the West Coast, moving through to some really big hail events in Colorado and in West Texas. That's actually more in the Panhandle, but I guess West Texas gets seen as the worst place for hail, but in fact it can hit all over that state. And then you've got some big flooding events and some tornadoes as well. So moving on into some examples of this, starting with floods. So the floods and the landslides in Thailand were the kind of record breaker. Back in 2011, they had the highest ever flood loss on record. It still stands. That was a US $43 billion event. And I think in general, you know, when you look back, flooding accounts for a big amount of these nat cat losses, more than $1 trillion over that 1980 to 2018 period. So yeah, just under half of that overall amount. From our point of view, only 12% of those were insured, but that's still a big sum of money. On the plus side, of all these extreme weather events, flooding is seen as the one that you can do the most about through proper mitigation, through really understanding and predicting the right size of event, through good civil design, good site maintenance, and really understanding what you're building on, because not all ground conditions are created equal. You can have a fantastic drainage design, but if you don't really understand that you're sitting on an aquifer with a really high water table, then you might as well have not bothered. So there's a lot can be done through good designing and good practice. Maybe I should have mentioned this earlier, but when you talk about flooding, there's basically three ways it can happen. You can have the flash flooding, which is just from the rain hitting the ground and overwhelming the ability of the ground to absorb it. So you get surface runoff, essentially. There'll be some infiltration to the soil, but if that's overwhelmed, the capacity of the soil is overwhelmed, then you get surface runoff going through whatever it hits before it hits an actual drain. Rivers bursting, this is just the rainwater hitting the rivers until they overflow their banks. And then the third one is a storm surge, as I touched on earlier, and they're actually the most deadly. And unfortunately, they're the ones that are the most clearly linked to sea level rise. The higher the sea levels, the more at risk coastal areas are of these storm surges kicking in. So worst case scenario, if you've got a very high tide, so you've got a spring tide with a very high tide anyway, and that coincides with a big storm event coming through, then your baseline is already high. It doesn't take much to overwhelm it. So, you know, when you look at the flooding in Katarina, that was what happened there. We had unfortunately, the worst timing from a tidal point of view. But sea level rise means those tides are getting higher inch and inch, you know, every 10 years. So it's again, unfortunately, a perfect storm. Okay, so for this case study then, it says tropical storm, but in fact, this is very similar to a site that we saw in Italy, a couple of sites there. So I'll kind of try and bring that in as I talk through this example. In this case, this was in the tropics, and there was a hurricane that hit in Italy. It was just a very, very big rainfall storm. Essentially, the same thing happened. Large volume of rainfall overwhelmed the drainage channels. The site in the tropics was under construction at the time, and you can see there a lot of shipping containers waiting to be opened up and deployed on site. All those containers contained inverters, and as you can see, the river burst and the water came through and went into those containers. So of the combiner boxes and string cables that were installed, they all got flooded with mud and water, so they all had to be replaced. A lot of water ingress to the inverter cabins and the UPS systems that were there already. And then critically, the project became disconnected from the grid. And in Axis, we've seen this as a problem on other sites as well. If we're relying on the grid to provide you with auxiliary power when your wind farm shuts down or your solar farm shuts down from the storm, if that power gets taken off because the national grid disconnects, then all the heating, the cooling, the air conditioning fans in your inverter cabins, they all stop working as well. So if you haven't got backup power, if you haven't got enough diesel generators, if you haven't got big enough UPS batteries, then you're kind of playing this cat and mouse game, hoping the grid comes back on so you can keep all your auxiliary power started running. If that doesn't happen, you run out of diesel, you run out of battery power, the whole site powers down, and you can have a lot of damage done to those inverters, battery components, because the air conditioning isn't working. It sounds so straightforward and so obvious. We've seen it on a number of occasions now. So yeah, critically, the grid came off here. And of course, the obvious thing as well from this photo is that the site was inaccessible for months. You know, you weren't going to get to this site unless you're in a canoe. That meant that the repair efforts were much longer, and the business interruption was therefore appreciably larger than it might well have been. Did the root cause? Again, it was really down to design. Project sponsors weren't really considering the right drainage system size. The culverts weren't big enough to deal with that much water. Also, fundamentally, they didn't take account of water coming in off neighboring areas. And this is something we saw in the Italian site as well. It's a very well-designed site, very well-run. The operators were really passionate about the project, and you could tell it was a really well-built project. The drainage system was probably decently sized, but they just didn't consider the area was going to get this much water. It just didn't exist in a flooding area as far as they were concerned. Had this reputation of being very dry. So when this flood kicked in, the rain kicked in, everything got overwhelmed. So when we actually looked back and looked at some of these storm events that had happened, we found that there'd been, I think, 3 or 4 similar sized rainfall events in the last 5 years. So again, this could be a climate change thing where you're developing on an area that is traditionally seen as a dry part of the land, hot and dry. Well, as weather patterns change, you know, so can the risk of precipitation. So again, it's about updating those designs and really making sure that you're considering the right worst case. On that project as well in Italy, the drains were fine, but they were blocked up and they hadn't maintained the drains. They had let kind of tree roots grow into them. So when the rain hit, they all just backed up. And then finally, I had this issue of the neighboring fields flooding into their site. In terms of mitigations, what could be done? Well, in both those sites, really, they could have done more to really understand the risk of getting a really big storm event. It's tricky with climate change because you're always having to look back at historical data. And the whole problem with climate change is that these events are a new thing. They're becoming more frequent and larger. So you can't just look back at historical data and say, okay, this site is normally this wet, so I'll assume it's going to be this wet for the next 20 years. You need to go further beyond that. You need to look at global circulation models and predictions of storm tracks. And fundamentally, I think, you know, it's a lot to be said for just allowing more headroom in the design. Also got to have the ground investigation data, really understand how permeable the soil is, and consider the wider drainage basin. So don't just look at your civil design for just your site. You need to understand, you know, what's happening uphill of my site. Is there good drainage there? What happens to those drains when they hit my site? Do they connect into my drains and therefore the water will flow through no problem, or do they just stop at a wall? In which case, you've got a problem. And then downhill of your site, where do your drains end up? Do they just pump into your farmer's field, your neighbor's field, or do they get diverted into a watercourse properly? So there's all these things to consider. You need to look at the site collectively, not just in isolation. And as I said earlier, maintenance-wise is really important as well, to keep them free of vegetation and make sure you're keeping all the culverts working, and your neighbors. If you've got a neighboring farmer or a landowner who you notice is not maintaining their drainage ditches, go and talk to them. And if you can't convince them to spend some money updating it, then you might have to spend some money on your site to mitigate it, whether that's increasing buffers and walls around your site, improving your drainage system. It doesn't sound like it's your problem, but ultimately floodwater doesn't care where your property starts and where it ends. It'll just come through and destroy it. So you need to look at the wider drainage basin and make sure your civil design is holistic, not just focused on your area. Okay, 10 minutes to go. I think pretty much on track. So just moving to hail then. As you can tell, a lot of this presentation is quite US focused, and I'll make no apologies for the fact that this next bit about hail is very US focused. But I'm presuming a lot of you guys and girls on the phone and the webinar will be OEMs, suppliers, etc., supplying to the States and other areas that see big bits of hail coming down. So hopefully this is still of interest. Certainly for us, where we write about half our business in the US. A lot of that is solar, both ground mounted and rooftop. And hail is really on our radar now, especially in the last kind of 6 months, where we're working really hard to understand about how we can really figure out this risk more and what we can do to really get our arms around the risk of it and become clued up about it. Okay, so in terms of trends, then it's on the increase. So in 2008, you suddenly had this big jump. Hail was running at about $8–12 billion damage a year from the claims. Globally, this is, and it suddenly jumped up to 19 billion just in the US. So we had this big jump, and since then it stayed close to that number. So in the United States, we're running at about that kind of 19–20 billion loss since then. This is just the next bullet point is from FM Global, and they've seen some big changes in their losses. So just on their book, they were seeing about 30 million's worth of claims a year. From 97 to 2006, and then post 2008, look at the jump there, massive increase. Okay, and what's that down to? There's a number of things. Key one is that cities and populations are spreading, so areas out in the farmlands and countrysides that weren't typically being hit are now on the doorstep of populations more. Property value increases, and more solar on roofs, where they're very susceptible to damage. It's not a clear link as yet with climate change. I think that's probably a stretch too far to say that there's a linear link between, temperatures increasing and hailstone storms getting bigger and more frequent. But there's something else driving this. It's not just more people on wider areas of land. We think there is a physical drive behind this as well. So where's worst? Well, Texas is the worst. There's the top 5 states in the US for hail. And Texas is twice as bad as the next one on the list, Colorado. Yeah, a fifth of all the claims that we've had over the last 20 years have come from Texas. It's a real hotspot. And as many of you may know, it's also a real big hotspot for solar. So there's something like 76 gigawatt solar PV in the pipeline to be connected in Texas. So that looks like a bit of an oil tanker heading towards a rock as far as this risk is concerned. It's a really big risk for Texas. So moving on to what this looks like then, in terms of what it does to panels, 2 things happen depending on the size of the hailstones. You get visible cracks where the glass is smashed, and then you get the kind of the silent killer, the non-visible micro cracking. On the right-hand side there, I've just shown you just a cross-section of 2 crystalline silicon designs. This is actually done by RCG, who are our technical consultants. So thanks for that, those guys, for doing this graphic for us. Yeah, the glass and glass designs, as you can imagine, have better resistance. You've got glass, then the cells, then the glass. So as the stress force comes down, you've got more protection to the cells. The ones with just one single layer of glass, so glass foil, you've got much more risk of stretching and then fracturing of the cells. Thin film doesn't suffer microcracking, but it can still crack. There's been some really impressive tests done by some of the thin film manufacturers showing, golf ball sized bits of hail and more surviving it. So 75 mil, it's this kind of size, it's a kind of a baseball sized bit of hail. And there's been some tests showing that thin film stuff withstands it, which is great. But the angle it's coming at and the speed also affects the survivability. So it's quite a complicated science. Okay, this is the final case study. It's a 5 megawatt site in West Texas, which I said is the kind of hailstorm corridor. A hailstorm came through in 2016. Based on the eyewitness accounts, the hailstones were about 40 mil. So yeah, what's that? It's about just under 2 inches in diameter. It's tracker. And unfortunately, the thing that I said earlier did happen, where they didn't properly go into stow mode. And as a result, all the panels just ended up facing the sky horizontally. And you can see there the damage on the panels there from the cracks from the hailstones. About a third of panels showed physical damage, but the microcracking was rampant, and they ended up replacing all the modules. Coming to certification in a minute. So those are certified to 25 mil, as I say, in that event, that was exceeded. So in terms of mitigations, I think there's a lot of good information in the certifications for the crystallines and the thin films. A standard is normally about 1 inch certification for hailstones in those designs. So the kind of standard, certainly going back a few years, was to withstand 1 inch hailstones. Although there are some OEMs now certifying modules to more than that, up to 45. As I say, there's some test results from some thin film, which shows much higher diameters being withstood. But I think critically, again, it's around design. So, if you've got your design, your certification to work to, you still need to understand what size hail to predict. So you've got a site, should I assume it's going to be a 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch size hail? There are databases out there, particularly in the States, that can be used to inform the design. And we're working with a couple of different people at the moment to understand more about how we can take those data of historical hail sizes and use that to come up with a more accurate prediction of the probable maximum loss. Okay, finally then, just onto wildfire. This is very focused. This certainly isn't something that we see in London, where I live, despite the best efforts of people leaving bottles and cans in the parks on dry grass. It's a severe killer in other parts of the world. So 90% of wildfires are man-made. And unfortunately, climate change is again creating a kind of perfect environment for the conditions to kick off these wildfires. So hotter, drier summers in areas which are already quite hot and dry, Australia and west coast of the States. You combine that with sparks from transformer stations or people leaving cigarettes on the ground, and it's just a tinderbox. You all have known about the ones in California last year. They were the biggest ones since 1930. And they've all happened this millennium. So it's a recent thing, and it's getting worse. That chart there on the right just shows it all. This is GIS Cali, and this shows overall losses in billions of dollars since 1980 again. Okay, you got a spike there in the early 90s, but then look at 2019. So 2018, bad year with losses of about 20 billion. And then 2019, even worse. And again, when you see that kind of trend where two really big events back on back, that tends to blow out a lot of the kind of standard assumptions around modeling, which is that you're going to get a fairly regular spacing of these big events, which drives your cost benefit analysis and makes sure you don't overestimate things. When you see things building up like this and getting, not one, but two events back to back, it starts to unravel the science and the calculations behind it, which makes it very hard to predict and very hard to get the right mitigations in place. The damage is pretty straightforward. There's a photo from California. It's the physical burning of the equipment, but there's also then smoke levels in the atmosphere reducing irradiance, so that you can't actually get decent sunlight into the sites. So even if a PV plant hasn't been torched by the wildfire, in that region, all the soot and the ash in the atmosphere brings irradiance right down. I think like 4 to 5%. We saw in Kern County on average, which is, as you all know, has a big knock-on effect on the megawatt hours and then the dollars that you're earning. Yeah, it's kind of a double hit there. And for us, in terms of secondary perils, wildfires become the number one. It's a first-tier catastrophe for the US property and casualty insurers. That's according to Munich Re. So it's very much on the agenda. 2018, yeah, I said earlier, it's about 24 billion. 2019, similar amount. That equated to about 18 billion in claims. And just going back to those two years, it was really some of the 6 worst of the last 10 years of wildfires. Critically, where those fires hit were relatively high population densities. So we've now got about 4.5 million US homes that have been put in the high risk category as having an extreme risk of wildfire. Of these, about half of those in California. And critically, for a state which I think California has 60 million people, those, that's a big amount of that. You're talking a very big number. So 15% of the homes in the state are in this high risk zone. So something we're really keeping an active eye on, and this is something that's very hard to mitigate once it's hit. So what can you do in the design phase? Well, it's all about really understanding where you're siting your sites, and making sure that you've got fire suppression built in, not just as a physical sprinkler system, but as in where you design this. Local fire services, really critical to work with them as well. So initially, where you're siting it, make sure you're putting it, with a decent distance from local bush or vegetation. Do a wildfire risk analysis. By doing that, you can figure out the potential behavior of the fire, and that considers the climate, the humidity, the wind. Again, this is all based on historical data, but you can use that to predict forward and take account of the likely worsening effect from climate change, increase the gain on those predictions, and get it maybe more realistic future prediction. Look at the fuel type, so what's growing around there, trees, vegetation, houses, and finally the moisture. So the drier the vegetation is, the more it's going to go up. During operations, maintain the landscape, maintain the vegetation, keep the fire breaks in place, make sure you're giving the fire no chance of jumping those fire breaks, hitting the site. And these are all, regulated distances. This building code set out how far you've got to keep these areas apart. Then just finally, once the fire's coming through, you're working with emergency services, make sure your emergency response plan is signed off by them and they're fully bought into it, so that when it hits, they know how to get to site, they can get their fire trucks into the site. This photo shows some water tanks there for them to use. Do you need to do that? Can they bring their own water? So just making the process as quick as possible to fight the fire. Okay, just to sum up then, we talked a lot about varying categories and types of NatCat risks. But to put it in context, 50% of the PV claims we see are from weather-related events, be they primary, secondary. We're seeing secondaries on the up, so really overtaking primary. We talked about the risk there for the flooding, as in 2018, overtaking primary in terms of the claim sizes. And these events, I'm afraid, becoming more intense, more frequent, and more destructive. The degree to which the first two are driven by climate science varies on the event, and it varies on where you are in the world. The third element around how destructive they are is driven a lot by anthropogenic effects. So where the buildings are, where the peoples are, more and more solar being built, more and more wind farms being built, putting areas in the risk of these NatCat disasters. So from our point of view, we want to keep working with the insured to understand more about the risk, design it properly, and make sure that wherever you can, you're mitigating out the risk so that you're reducing the possible damage as much as possible. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dan, for this great overview and very interesting overview on the different types of natural disasters that are impacting solar projects, and also for your recommendations on how to mitigate risks. So during the presentations, we've already received a couple of questions from the audience, and so since we only have 10 minutes left, I would directly go ahead and read out some of these questions. Not sure we will have time for all of them, but maybe we could start with some technical questions on how Heisz operates when it comes to insuring projects. So is a solar project typically underwritten during, so during which phase is a solar project typically underwritten? During the development and the construction phase, or after the project is commissioned? And so related to this question is another one from the same person. Could you give an overview of the due diligence done by Heisz when underwriting a solar project?
Yeah, no problem. So it's the first question then. The answer is we can do both. So we can write to cover the transportation of the equipment to the site. We can write what we call construction loss, so that covers losses that occur during construction. There has to be a physical trigger. We call it a trigger. So it has to be like a physical damage to the equipment during the construction to trigger a business interruption claim. But if, for example, an inverter falls off the back of a truck during construction and that delays things, then we will cover the cost of that inverter being replaced and any delay on the startup as well. And then the third thing we'll cover is the OAL, so the operational period as well. And it tends to be done on a yearly basis where we will cover PD, so property damage from an event like this, and then the associated BI, business interruption. Again, that's just, you know, if you're off for 30 days replacing main transformer and the claim's approved, then we'll pay for the lost revenue as well. We don't cover during development. So, you know, that kind of 1-2% you spend on your CapEx on development, that's kind of at risk. But we do cover construction and operations. In terms of due diligence, so we work with brokers and we have a questionnaire which we provide to brokers, which they will then take to the potential insured and ask them to provide data. So this is everything from kind of concept design through to suitability analysis, where the project is, how many transformers there are, you know, have you done the ground risk assessment, and so on and so forth. So we have a checklist of things that we ask them to fill in via the broker. Our underwriting team will then take those data, if need be, I'll get involved as well if there's a bit more analysis to be done, and then we use that to inform our quote for the deductible and the premium. And then finally, I guess on the due diligence side, we're also very keen on doing site surveys post-event or even pre-event, where we take kind of a technical due diligence approach and look at areas that could be improved upon.
Thanks. And so for projects that are insured by Heisz, what control do you have on the operations of the project? So, for example, what would be the claim process if trackers in a project were not put into safety position during a hailstorm?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, ultimately, we ask the insured to understand both the limitations and the certification of their equipment, and also to operate it correctly. So to that end, it needs to be maintained properly. The systems need to be shown to be functioning prior to the event. In that case, it's a bit of a grey area sometimes. But to give I guess a similar example, we've been involved in a project where the grid went out for a long time, and what that resulted in was there being no HVAC, so no dehumidification, no air conditioning in the inverter cabins overnight. And it was in a tropical location, so at night you got condensation building up, and that then attacked the power control systems and they started rusting. And in that case, that actually led back to a warranty claim on the OEM, because the site was still quite new, to replace the broken components. It's an ongoing process. Because ultimately, you can argue that they knew that event could come through, and they should have done more to have backup power to keep all the fans spinning and the AC spinning. And in our experience, when it comes to warranty claims, OEMs are usually pretty tight on that stuff. So to summarize, you know, we look for best practice being followed, and for wherever possible, the equipment to be used within its intended purposes. If the equipment failed and it wasn't able to go into stow mode, then we'd want to dig into more as to why that happened. You know, was it a design defect? Was it operator error? was it just the winds being above the design limit and just overwhelming the actuators so they couldn't physically go into stow mode? So I'm afraid there's no like black and white answer to that, but we would work with the insured to understand what happened. But fundamentally, our aim is to keep the projects on the bars and still working. So we try and find solutions wherever we can.
Thanks. So another question related to limiting the tilt angle, because you suggested that in the case of strong winds, the tilt angle should be limited to avoid liftoff. But on the other side, this could impact the generation, of course. And so the question is, so what exactly you are meaning, whether the tilt angle should be only limited seasonally or in certain situations in case of trackers, or what's the recommendation?
Yeah, it's a great point. I forgot to mention that. It is the flip side of it, isn't it? Because if the lower the tilt angle, the lower the irradiance, the lower you're reducing output. I think it's a balance. Obviously, if it's a fixed PV site, you haven't got the luxury of altering the angle of attack. Well, I suppose it is the angle of attack when you talk about being a wing. I'll give you an example. I went to a really good site in Puerto Rico where they had it was a fairly sloping site. They had really strong support structures, to be fair. They kind of over-designed the support structures, really good foundations. They had a bit of erosion on the tracks, but ultimately they had, I think it was thin film panels, and they'd followed the contours pretty much flat of the site, and there was very little angle at all. And they just decided that given the risk of the hurricane coming through, they'd rather suffer the lower output and have lower risk of these things taken off. We saw another site which took a different approach and had, I think, only a few degrees more angle on it, and they suffered way more loss. So it's a cost-benefit analysis, isn't it? You've got to consider both. But I would say there's not just the angle of attack. The reason the first site survived really well was they had separate fasteners on each panel. They weren't doing double fasteners. So really robust support systems. The bracketing and the bracing was really strong. So the units weren't moving, they weren't flexing, so you weren't getting micro cracking. But I remember asking that on the site visit, and they said, we just figured, we're in Puerto Rico, we've had hurricanes come through in the past. We would rather eat a bit of the energy, but have a site that's flat and less likely to take off.
So I guess another big dilemma related to locking the panels horizontally could be to decide whether you want to suffer from the hailstorm or from the strong wind, right? Because if panels are locked in horizontally, then the probability to get a damage from hail is bigger.
Yeah. I mean, on that one, that should have stowed completely over, so that should have completely folded over, and it only got halfway through. But yeah, absolutely. And that's a really good point. When you're designing for these things, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, you don't just have a risk of high winds. You have the high winds and the hail. So, you need to be considering in the lower structure what bracketing and supports you need to withstand the wind speeds. But then again, make a decision as to what's the lesser of two evils in some ways. But in general terms, for example, you don't get hurricanes in Texas, you get tornadoes, but those big tropical storms don't make it that far inland. So most of the losses we see are from the hail. But yeah, you're right. I think if a really high wind speed event had hit that site as well as the hail, then you would have had the hail damage, and then they probably would have taken off as well.
So considering that we only have 1 more minute left, some questions related to Heisz and your services. So what size of projects do you insure and what's the territory that you cover? Europe, India, Australia. So we understood from your presentation that you're present in the US. What other territories do you cover, and do you also cover against underperformance of installations?
Very quickly then, so we're global. We have written risks from West Coast California through to Philippines, everywhere in between. We've got a Singapore office as well, from which we write risks in Asia. So global. Yeah, we have typically covered all types of risks, wind, solar, battery storage. We don't cover underperformance at the moment. But my background is actually in resource assessment, so I'm interested in whether that comes through. And we're always interested in the opportunities and backing it up with the right technical know-how. So before we offer a new product, we'd obviously make sure we understand the science behind it.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan Stevens, risk engineer at Axis Capital. Thank you very much for the great presentation. It was a pleasure to have you here, and thank you also very much to the participants, and also for the smart and great questions that enabled a good discussion with Daniel here in the last 15 minutes of this webinar. So as a final word, please have a look at the slide that is currently being shared. As part of our online visibility opportunities, you can enhance your digital presence. So in case you're interested in organizing webinars, podcasts, or getting visibility in newsletters or online reports with SolarPower Europe, the European Solar Industry Association, please feel free to get in touch with us, with my colleague Luis Manso, whose email address you can see on the slide. And so I would also like to highlight our upcoming online events. All of them are part of our Shine on Digital series, including the launch of our Grids working group on the 10th of June, so tomorrow, and in particular the online launch conference of our next global solar market outlook for solar PV 2020 to 2024. It will be launched on the 16th of June, so next week, in cooperation with Intersolar. Please have a look at our website and register. So thank you very much again also to Axis Capital for sponsoring this webinar, and I would like to wish everyone a nice rest of the day. Goodbye.
Thank you.